Wow. I think we all just had a spiritual experience together. Do you agree? Yes. So I have to ask these people here who just gave us that experience if y'all just showed up this morning and just did that. Yes? No? No. So I'm guessing, or assuming, that you practiced some before just doing that this morning. Am I right? Yes. So I spent some time wondering this week, knowing that this piece would be shared with all of us, how many hours of practice might have gone into creating just those few minutes of beauty, or of transcendence, we could say, for all of us. And I did just some guesstimating, so maybe there's 50 of you or so, and just one professional musician like our own Rick Fortner. Yes. I think we'll just give him the benefit of the doubt and say he's been practicing about 40 years. I think he started when he was pretty young. So if we multiply 365 days by 40 years, you get 14,600 days. And if you average out the days you practice a lot, and then the days you skipped practicing, not that you would ever do that, right? And just average it all out and say he's practiced an hour a day for 40 years, that's 14,500 hours of practice. And then we have a couple other professional, at least 2 other, probably more out there, professional musicians with us, so that adds another 29,000 hours of practice. If you just put these 3 gentlemen together, you have 43,500 hours of practice. And then I just thought I'd multiply by 10. My own daughter is here singing, and she took cello lessons and sang in choirs. So I think I'm way underestimating. But if we multiply that 43.5 by 10, I could probably do by 50, but 10's easier. We get 435,000 hours of practice to create those few moments of transcendent spiritual bliss. It's astounding, isn't it? And it made me wonder, why would I think it should be any different for me or for you? I'll leave you with that question for a minute. While I ask some of these musicians a few questions, I thought you'd be as curious as I am about their practice habits. So either one of you can start. So do you practice every day?
Not really.
Not really. Do you like to practice?
When I was growing up, no.
Fair.
As an older age, yes.
Okay. And could you just give us a little snippet of like what you would practice to prepare for a gig like this morning? Just like... Thank you. Yeah. That sounds more like playing to me than practice, but whatever. I guess that's when you do it, over and over again. And so what about you? Do you practice every day?
No, I don't have time to, but I virtual practice, which means whenever I hear music, if it's in the radio or I hear it coming through the windows, I put myself in that music and act like I'm playing to it, so I'm a virtual practicer.
Virtual practice. I can see you on the steering wheel at a red light this week. I'm going to be looking over, and it's going to be like... And can you give us a little example of what you might practice before something like today? Cool. It's good he stopped because I was going to start dancing. So Rick, Mr. Fortner, I'm guessing that you practice too?
I do.
Do you?
Yeah.
do you practice? Dare I ask, do you practice every day?
No, not really.
Not really.
Should I?
Only you know.
That was a part of ours.
No, we didn't rehearse that one. No. So, how old were you when you started to play?
Around 6, 7, or 8, right in there.
6, 7, 8.
Yes.
I was 6 too. That's so. Did you like to practice when you were a kid?
Well, no, I never wanted to at the beginning, but once I started going, I would even practice longer than I should have. We're scheduled to, but at first, no.
And what's it like these days for you? Is it hard to, I know you have a busy schedule, you lead, do a lot of worship, leading and creating. What's it like these days when you want or should practice?
Well, I know that I have to, but again, once I start, then it becomes more play, like we heard with John.
So it gets easier.
It does. And the rewards are so wonderful.
Aren't they? The rewards are so wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, wait, is there something you didn't tell us? Oh, did you tell us what your mother did when you were little? Yes, you did.
You weren't going to bring that up. Well, she would set a timer on top of the piano. And she'd say, Rick Jr., you cannot leave this bench until this goes off.
You guys might want to try that with yourselves if you decide you pick up a spiritual practice this month in an egg timer. Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you, all of you. So we all know that we don't necessarily share the musical gifts that our performers or our choir members do, but I would say that we all have been practicing something ever since we were very young, whether it was intentional or unintentional. And for better or for worse, we actually are what we practice. Or as the neuroscience experts would say today, our states become our traits. Our states of mind, become our traits or our behaviors, what we're capable of doing, which goes for lying and also for generosity. Goes for our healthy and our not so healthy habits. Our states become our traits. Which means that how we feel, our states matter, and what we think matters. And paying attention to how our thoughts and our feelings are interacting inside of us matters a lot. Because what we pay attention to, what we're aware of, what we choose to focus on, actually shapes our brains. So the consequences, we know from our own lives that the consequences of being in one state of mind or another have enormous impacts on our marriages, on our parenting and our grandparenting, on our friendships, on our successes and failures at work and in life. Thinking about it, I thought it's actually one reason we come to church, because it's a little bit easier to be mindful here. Part of why this sanctuary feels like a sacred space is because people come here intentionally to practice being aware. It's a bit easier, I think, to tune into and stay focused on something as beautiful as that Kyrie when it's being sung in here in this sanctuary instead of in a secular venue. For one reason, there are still social conventions against texting during worship, more or less. Don't worry, I don't think any of you were distracted during that anthem. It would have been hard to pull ourselves away from that. It was so powerful. But there's a story I remembered from the news a few years ago. You may remember it too. It was the one about Joshua Bell. Do you remember this? He played his violin in the Washington, D.C. Metro a few years ago. He's one of the top concert violinists in the world, and he volunteered to be part of a social experiment. So one morning during the work commute hour, he played 6 incredible pieces of music while about 2,000 people passed through the train station. What happened? About 3 minutes after he started playing, a middle-aged man turned to look at him and then kept on walking. Another few minutes later, a woman tossed a dollar bill into his violin case and then kept on walking. After 6 minutes, somebody actually leaned against the wall and stopped to listen. Then a 3-year-old tried to stop to listen, but his mom just kept pulling him along, even as she was turning back, still trying to listen. Several other children and parents repeated the same thing. Mr. Bell played in total for 43 minutes, and only 7 people stopped to listen. 27 of those 2,000 people tossed in some bills and some change for a grand total of $32 in his open violin case. 1,070 people hurried by. Very few turned to look. When he finished playing each piece absolutely perfectly, it was silent, meaning no one applauded. I don't know how much Joshua Bell actually gets paid, but we can imagine it's quite a bit. I know that he was playing a $3.5 million violin, and that he had just sold out a concert in Boston, and each ticket was $100 starting price. So the questions people have asked themselves since this experiment took place is this: if we don't have time to stop and listen to one of the best musicians in the world, playing some of the finest music ever written, with one of the most beautiful instruments ever made, how many other things are we missing in life? Watching the video afterwards, Bell himself said he was mystified by only one thing. He understood why he wasn't drawing a crowd in the rush of a morning workday, but he was surprised at the number of people who didn't pay attention at all, as if he were invisible. He started coming up with theories, started climbing up that ladder of assumptions Marlon shared with us a couple weeks ago. He thought maybe people were ignoring him on purpose to avoid feeling guilty about not dropping money into the violin case. It's possible, plausible. The only problem is that when asked, nobody gave that explanation. When interviewed later, people mostly just said that they were busy. Some remembered having to speak louder actually on their cell phones to block out the beautiful, if annoying, music. Not Calvin, though. When Calvin got to the top of the escalator where Mr. Bell was, he turned right and headed out the door straight to the street. A few hours later, when interviewed by those who had staged the experiment, he had actually no memory that there had been a musician there at all. "Where was he in relation to me?" Calvin asked the interviewer. "About 4 feet away," the journalist told him. Now, you need to know there wasn't anything wrong with Calvin's eyesight or hearing. He did, however, have earbuds in his ears and was listening to the music on his smartphone. Interestingly enough, the song that Calvin was listening to was called Just Like Heaven. I don't know if you know that song. It's a song by Cure, rock band, and it's not a bad song. Paradoxically, it's about a tragic emotional disconnect in a love relationship. It's a story about a man who has found the woman of his dreams but can't express the depth of his feeling for her until she's gone. Ultimately, it's a song about failing to see the beauty of what's plainly in front of us until it's too late. Unfortunately, that's not really news. We know we're mindless a lot of the time. How often have you arrived home not remembering the last 10 blocks you just drove through? Thank you for nodding, it's not just me. That's the bad news this morning. We are mindless. The good news is we can learn to be mindful with practice. It's really good news for me, as I'm not by nature a very mindful person, and I do have my daughter in the front row, so keeping me honest here this morning. I am easily distracted, and often I'm overwhelmed, really, by the force of feelings going on, sometimes storming around inside of me. But I've lived long enough now to know that I'm not my mind or my emotions. And actually, watching my own dad lose the mind he had over these past couple of years because of his Alzheimer's, it's really only deepened my understanding that none of us are our minds. Because even when he no longer knows who I am, and that day's probably coming sooner than I would like it to, or doesn't know who he is, I know I want him to be treated with respect and granted his full human dignity, no matter what, because he's more than his mind and his emotions. So our language also reflects this reality. We say things like, "I'm not myself today," or "that wasn't the real me," or "you've never seen what she's really like on the inside," or "he retreats into his shell to protect himself. She's still searching for her true self. Have you noticed how he's coming into his own?" All of those expressions indicate, and we use them all the time, day in, day out, that we live at multiple levels and spend our lives really discovering, uncovering, and recovering who we actually are. Neuroscientists and social psychologists today say, I love this one, mindfulness is to the mind what aerobic exercise is to the heart. It's kind of amazing because in that piece of music, I could just feel my heart like my chest was bursting. So mindfulness is to the mind what aerobic exercise is to the heart. Every time we pause and pay attention, every time we give ourselves a moment, just a moment to recalibrate, to remember we're more than our thoughts or our feelings, we strengthen our spirits. We find a little more freedom. We can rest, recover, and reframe old misunderstandings so we can stop repeating them. It sounds so great. And it's so difficult to do. It's so difficult to resist the demands of the everyday world and to take time out. But that's precisely what spiritual practices are for, which is our theme for the month. It's really hard because few of us are taught when we were young enough, as Rick was taught to play the piano, or these gentlemen to play their instruments. Few of us are taught how to care for our hearts and souls and minds, never mind our bodies. So few of us developed good mental or spiritual habits when we were children. Many of us have learned later on what healthy eating and regular exercise will do for us, but we also need food for our souls, rest for our minds, and exercise for our spirits. There's something inside each one of us that is solitary, stable, and free. Some would call it the soul. The purpose of practice is to reconnect us with that part of us. There are lots and lots of practices to choose from these days, especially if you go to All Souls Unitarian Church. You know, of course, there's centering prayer, there's all kinds of yoga. We teach several kinds on Wednesday evenings here. Some people take a simple morning or evening walk. People keep a gratitude journal. Some of you do. Raise your hand if you keep a gratitude journal. Raise your hands high. Is that all of you? Okay, well, look around you. That's not enough of you. This might be the one you want to try this month. There's really good data that people who keep a daily or weekly gratitude journal have less stress, more well-being, more inner peace, and are more likely to make positive changes in their lives. And of course, the internet is full of good suggestions, and I'm sure your neighbors in the pews would be happy to share their practices with you. There's a lot to choose from. It won't be hard for you to find one to try. The challenge is going to be doing the same thing over and over and over again. That's what's difficult. And you've told me yourselves over the years why you can't pick up a practice today or this week or this month. You've told me things like, I think one of our drummers said this, I don't have time. You said to me, I have too much on my plate already. I have ADD, I have OCD, I've tried CBT, SSRIs, and my mind still won't stop. My mind can't stop. I'm too tired. What if I fail at this, too? Sound familiar? The thing is, you can't really fail when you're practicing awareness. All you have to do is notice what's around you. And because the world itself is full of wonder, the minute we slow down long enough to see or hear or feel what's right here, our consciousness changes. It helps to have a spiritual practice partner, I'll call it this morning. My husband, I'm very thankful to my husband, who's great at reminding me when I say, but I don't have time. Time and time again, he'll say back to me, if you're saying that, Barbara, it means it's even more important for you to take the time. Claiming time to stare at the stars, to rescue an abandoned kitten, to hold an infant, to sit on the porch and watch the sun rise or set. Those are all ways we return to reverence for the world in which we live and move and have our being, and away from the anxieties and stressors and distractions of the day. I imagine, or I hope as I say this, that you can remember certain practices that bring you back to the awe you felt as a child, but sometimes lose sight of as an adult. For me, the first bulbs breaking through the frozen ground and lingering snow cover in springtime, that's because I grew up in New England, not here in Oklahoma, were as exciting and full of promise as anything I could imagine. The problem is once we take on the responsibility of adults, it's difficult to disconnect. It gets harder and harder to disconnect from the world of consensual reality that would keep us plugged in 24/7, 365 days a year, 20 years straight without interruption, if we let it. But we miss so much if we don't practice slowing down, even stopping. If we don't practice paying attention and changing direction. Which made me think of the story of Moses, a story you've all heard, Moses in the burning bush. A quick summary goes like this. Moses was tending his father-in-law's sheep. We often forget, though, that Moses was a murderer. He had already killed a man in Egypt, then barely escaped with his life and his people. So I can imagine he was probably relieved to be way out in the wilderness, tending a flock of wild animals, finally safe and anonymous and far away from the Pharaoh. On this day, he's walking up a mountain following his sheep when something catches his attention. Now, Moses could have ignored it. It actually wasn't in front of him. It would have been easier to avoid the trouble of stopping, maybe smart to avoid the trouble, knowing who he was, and just keep on walking, doing his own business. But instead, he slows down and he turns to look and see. And when the Lord saw that Moses had turned aside to see, he called to him and said, "Here I am." Moses had to pay attention for God to show up. We have to stop, turn, look, and listen if we want to meet God in our lives too. God or truth or beauty or love does show up then, because just paying attention is holy work. It's at the core of what we do on all our pastoral care teams. We don't prevent any illnesses from progressing or stop death at any door. We just show up and pay attention, and that's enough. There's a story I remember reading about a woman who wasn't sure she wanted to go on living. She was old and lived alone. She didn't want to go to sleep at night because she was afraid she wouldn't wake up in the morning, so she lay in bed waiting for the sun to come up before she dared even to shut her eyes. Then someone who loved her suggested that since she was awake anyway, she might as well start listening for the first bird that sang each morning. So she did. And soon she named the bird. Then she discovered what that kind of bird liked to eat, and then she put feeders with that kind of bird seed in her yard. And other birds came, and she learned their names too. And she bought different kinds of bird seeds, and she started to collect bird feeders and hang them from the rafters of her porch. And so for this woman, the song of the first bird became a sacrament that brought her back to life. She says she still doesn't sleep so well, but she's no longer afraid of her life. Anything can be a sacrament, reconnecting us back to the sacredness of life. It all depends on how we look at it, on how we perceive what's right in front of us, if we take the time to see what's right in front of us. Because paying attention changes us. When we can stop judging our feelings and our thoughts and our bodies as either good or bad, we can start practicing who we want to be. We can stop thinking if it's good, I have to have it. If it's bad, I have to avoid it. The fact is, just as we learn to ride a bike or play an instrument or share our toys, we can learn to be virtuous and we can learn to love ourselves. Yes, we can even learn that. If we want to be more generous, we can practice being more generous. If we want to be more forgiving, we can practice forgiving. If we want to be more calm, we can practice being calmer. It's a good one for me. If we want to be more kind, we can practice being kinder. If we want to be more patient, we can practice being patient. If we want to be more compassionate, we can practice feeling. So I want to leave you with an assignment this morning. Of course, it's going to be up to you whether you take it on, whether you choose to practice it or not. The question really is not, however, can I do this practice? Because I know you all can. The question is, how can I? Not can I, but how can I? How can I practice the thing I know is true about me, but I lose sight of, so it can become who I am? How can I practice until my desired state becomes my trait? It works, practice works, as these musicians know, because any small thing repeated routinely adds up over time to produce big results, like that Kyrie we heard. It's not different for any one of us. Before I give you that assignment, though, I have to tell you one more thing that happened when Joshua Bell was playing in that subway in Washington, D.C. There was another man named John who was riding the subway that morning. When he was asked if anything unusual had happened on his commute, of all the people interviewed, he was the only one who immediately mentioned a violinist. There was a musician playing at the top of the escalator, he said. Haven't you seen musicians there before? The journalist challenged him. Not like this one, he answered. What do you mean? The interviewer continued. This was a superb violinist, he said. I've never heard anyone like that play. He was amazing. I walked a distance away to hear him. I didn't want to intrude on his space. Really? The journalist asked. Really. It was that kind of an experience. It was just brilliant. It was an incredible way to start my day. And other people they weren't getting it. It wasn't registering. It was baffling to me. It may happen to you too if you decide to practice this month, because the more aware you are, the more mindful you become, the more surprised you'll be by other people's mindlessness. Of course, we can't always be falling to our knees to count the crocuses breaking through the cover of snow, but we can practice paying attention. So here are the two practices. The first one is for you if you live alone at home. And if your mind is rebelling right now, if you're starting to feel afraid or that you can't do it, if you're starting to make up excuses already, I'm going to give you a little tidbit of science. The way you pay attention activates the brain in certain very specific ways. And it looks like the activation creates a state of mind that we call mindful awareness. When that state is recreated in personal practices, that state will become ultimately a trait of the individual. Ultimately, the structure of the brain develops and grows in the direction of mindful traits. So here's the first one. When you come home at the end of your day, okay, I take that back. This is for people who do live with somebody. I got that backwards. As soon as you get home, as soon as possible, notice 5 new things about the person you live with. Got it? Make them as specific as possible and see what happens. I promise something in your relationship will change. And then if you live alone, here's the other assignment. If you're really ambitious, you can do both, depending on what your life is like. And even if you live alone, you can practice that one that I just said with people you work with, right, or people you see. So every time before you eat this week, try to pause and place your hand over your heart. Try to remember before you begin, but if you forget, just do it whenever you think of it, during the meal, at the end of the meal, 2 hours later when you remember that you forgot, and see what happens. I promise you, something will change. Practice doesn't make us perfect. That was a lie they told us when we were young. Am I right? It's actually the opposite. Practice helps us see all our imperfections and the world's imperfections much more clearly. The paradox is practice also helps us see all the beauty and all the love at the very same time. Practice simply makes it easier to stop and to turn and to pay attention, to hear and feel gratitude, acceptance, love, and forgiveness more frequently, to notice and know the beauty and power, the holiness of the present moment despite all its imperfections. And that is worth the practice, I hope you'll agree. So are you ready? Get set. This is your one and only life. Get set and go. Why not stop and turn and listen and see what happens?
Thanks for tuning in online. We are so pleased with all the different people who have been tuning in from all over the country and all over the world. If you have a chance to send me an email or connect with me in some way, let me know what you're finding, why you tune in, and what you're getting out of it. I would love to hear from you. And if you get a chance to make a gift to support this ministry, to become a partner, we would love to partner with you and have you be a friend of the church and somebody who is actually supporting us to create this congregation and the world that we're trying to create together. You can be a part of it, and every gift of every amount makes a difference. We really appreciate your support.